to talk about market structures for renewable energy, and with a more detailed title, as I call it here, electricity markets with high renewable shares, focusing on price formation and cost recovery. So now we are doing a little bit of a deep dive into the actual market conditions for renewables. And I will present some rather new work, which is largely based on the material that I've been working on together with Dr. Audun Botterud at MIT, also triggered by my research stay there a couple of years ago. And I will jump to the conclusions first. So we have made a report or a journal manuscript that can be downloaded from MIT. It's called Optimality Conditions and Cost Recovery in Electricity Markets with Variable Renewable Energy and Energy Storage. And when I say that we jump to the conclusions first, is that actually we started this work and this research by exploring how renewable energy and energy storage influence the profitability of generators and other technologies in the market. And a common hypothesis is that traditional electricity markets fail under large-scale penetration of wind and solar, since these technologies are driven by natural variations in the energy source and produced with zero marginal cost. And this is then foreseen to lead to a price collapse in the market, and the plans that are needed for balancing are pushed out of the market. So this was also our hypothesis, actually, when we started this, to prove that the energy-only markets fail with wind, solar, and storage. However, our results from this study, where we used well-established market theory as a starting point, showed that there actually exist market equilibria where all the plants recovers their costs. Now, in theory. And the prices that are obtained in the markets with the thermal, wind, solar, and storage, they are well defined over the course of the year. So our suggestion from this work is to think twice before embarking on a complete redesign of electricity markets. But of course, we must remember there's a difference between theory and practice. So, but it's good to know that actually it works in theory, because if the energy-only markets would have failed in theory, then it's we should absolutely do something. Now, if theory is too far away from practice, we also need to do something, but then we have to establish a new theoretical fundament for other market structures. But before we come into the details, just want to look at how the present markets work. We know very well the so-called merit order effect of wind and solar power, and it's evident in many places. So several studies based on real market data conclude that prices decline with the integration of renewables, since they produce at zero marginal cost or close to zero marginal cost. But we must also bear in mind that there are other price effects that can be much more dominant in the markets, such as the gas price effect observed in the US market some years ago, and also for when we look at scenarios towards 2050, this expected rise in the CO2 prices will kind of counteract the decline in prices due to the integration of variable renewables. So speaking about scenarios, there are many research studies that also have analyzed how integration of wind and solar will reduce prices in the future. using detailed power market simulations. So not historical data, but market simulations. This figure shows the estimated effect in several studies from the US, but similar results are found for Europe in many publications about this. Now these simulations, they assume often generation portfolios that are set as an input to the models and not a part of this system optimum, the long-term system optimum. So they do not often analyze the profitability of these renewable power plants in a market setting. And the main reason for that is that up till now, investments in renewables have been largely driven by some kind of subsidy policy or different incentives. But the recent cost reductions in both wind and solar has changed this picture and will change it a lot for the coming years. So it is therefore a need for us to analyze how these technologies influence the investment in other generation and balancing equipment in a competitive setting. So without any subsidies, wind and solar will be present in these markets, and how does this interact with the other technologies without any subsidies for investments or feed-in tariffs, and how will the profitability of all these plants be without subsidies. So just to bring in some scales of renewable penetration that we talk about, I can show some results from a recently study that we did on power system decarbonization pathways for Italy by 2050. So this work is based on power system optimization using cost scenarios for technologies and fuels for 2050. So it is a system cost minimization model. So it's the central planner approach to kind of simulate the market, the common approach. I'll come back to alternatives very soon. But if you look at the figure to the left, it's evident that renewables, and then especially in this case, especially solar and wind, takes a dominating role, even without any cost for CO2 emissions. So we put the zero CO2 constraint at the left-hand part of this figure. We still see that wind and solar is dominating without any subsidies, just using the cost scenarios from the EU reference scenario that was developed in 2018, I think. And this figure is without storage. So if we add storage costs, also storage cost scenarios up to 2050 to the total cost minimization problem, we see that storage in the form of lithium-ion batteries triggers a lot more solar, and it gets a little bit less wind and a lot more solar because of that these two technologies, they are complementing each other, which is due to the characteristics of batteries with relatively cheap provision of power for up to some hours, but long-term storage in lithium-ion batteries becomes very expensive. So it kind of favors the small scale or the balancing of solar power in shorter time frames. And again, no subsidies are assumed in this study. But these results, they are obtained using system optimization. which takes a central planner's perspective and minimize total cost. But how would this actually work in a competitive market? Are the short-term prices that results from such scenarios that we show here, are the short-term prices sufficient to recover the long-term costs of all the assets present? So this is the main research question that we have been exploring. And our fundament for this study is a basic energy only markets, which is the present market type. Most power or electricity in Europe is exchanged through energy only markets, typically then a combination of day ahead markets and intraday markets. And then there are balancing markets to clear out for uncertainties at the short-term production and demand uncertainties. And classical market works from the 70s and 80s have shown that energy-only markets lead to system optimal investments and operation in equilibrium. That means that all the generation companies that are price takers in the market, they maximize their profit and recovers their cost. And the market solution, the competitive market solution, is the same as the central planners or the solution to the central planners problem. However, this classical market works was limited to traditional thermal generation, and next to zero analysis have been carried out for renewable energies and storage, and not for competitive in a competitive setting. There have been some studies on renewables with subsidies as an external input, but not as a part of the optimal mix. And in our model, it is the scarcity pricing or the value of lost load that ensures the cost recovery of the most expensive thermal generator. So we don't assume any capacity markets in this study. It's actually we are working on that at the moment. How the capacity markets are influencing the market, the solution. So we then establish as simple system as practically possible. You can see this in the figure here. The demand is fixed, of course, unless we have load shedding. Then there are some that means that there are forced outages. But then we have to pay a very high scarcity price. And the base load plant and peaker plants are thermal generators, and we have variable renewables, which can be wind or solar. We use wind as example here with zero marginal cost. And then we have a generalized energy storage device, which is represented by its charging and discharging losses and power capacity and some energy capacity as well. So the central planner's problem here is to find the plant capacities and operation that minimize the cost of delivered energy to the customers. So our objective function looks like this: minimize C, which is the annualized investment cost plus the annual operating cost. And this problem is subject to a set of technical constraints and maybe some CO2 constraints as well. This is actually the formulation that are used in typical market models or capacity expansion models, which is then simulating the market. But it is a cost minimization problem. It's not a competitive market model. So if you look at the market problem, then all the actors, at least all the generators, should maximize their profits. And then the problem is then formulated in this way. So we have to find the plant capacities and plant operation which maximize individual profits of all the plants. So then we maximize then pi, which is then the annual market revenues minus the operation cost minus the annualized investment cost. And I have to do this for each of the different generators, assuming perfect market, which is then that each plant owner is small enough to not influence prices, and generators bid their marginal cost in the energy-only market, and storage owners also then bid their marginal value of stored energy, which is called opportunity cost, which is then what they can receive from the discharged energy at a later stage when they discharge the device. So an analytical model of this problem with only thermal generation can be exactly solved by using duration curve approach. So this is just to sort the yearly time series of demand with the highest value first, as shown in the figure. And in this case, we have just two thermal generators, baseload plant and the peaker plant. And the baseload plant is operated the whole time, and it earns money only when the price is higher than its marginal cost. And that is when the price is set by the peaker generation or by load shedding. Well, the peaker generation get returns on their investment only when the price is higher than its marginal cost, which is then when there are load shedding. So the optimal solution to this problem implies that there must be some load shedding in the market. So the question is how to set that price. That's a whole other story that I will not go into here. But the point is that there has to be some load shedding without capacity payments to get for the peaker plant to receive its enough revenue from the market. So if we solve this problem from the system cost minimization problem, we can then just take the derivative of the cost function for all the plant capacities and set them equal to 0. And we then receive the optimal duration of these technologies. Now, if we do the same for a profit maximization point of view, where we maximize each actor's profit, we get the same result. This is the classical result from the 70s. And all plants then receives a net profit of 0, which is the optimality condition. So now the new thing is to bring in wind power here. So what happens then with the market solution and the prices? So here we show a figure where we have a high amount of wind power in the system. So we now present the net demand, which is then the demand subtracted the wind generation, also sorted. That's why it's negative under in some of the hours, which just means that we have a surplus of wind energy and we have to curtail some of the wind energy to have a balance between the consumption and production. And when wind is curtailed, there will be no thermal production from the thermal plants. So that is why we have introduced a new duration here, TB, which is the duration of the baseload plant. But the optimality conditions for the peaker plant and the baseload plant is the same as without wind, because you remember now that they only earn money when the prices are higher than their marginal cost, and the price will not be higher when we introduce wind power, since the marginal cost is 0. So the optimal duration of these technologies are the same as without wind power. So what And we can then see also visually here that what will change is their optimal capacities. So the duration of the price segments are the same with wind energy, but the plant capacities will differ. And now we have introduced one more variable to the problem, and that is the optimal capacity of the wind power plant, and that is then determined by the duration of the baseload plant. Because when we have curtailment of wind energy, it doesn't earn any money because then the price is zero. We have surplus of zero marginal cost generation. But all other hours, the wind power plant earns money. And if we solve the problem in the same way as the classical problem with only thermal generations, but we solve it for wind energy, we get an equilibrium where it also recovers all it costs. And this we can derive analytically without any optimization or numerical calculations. And we get some less baseload capacity, some more peaking capacity, and some more load shedding, but the same duration of load shedding, and also some variable renewable curtailment if the wind power is sufficiently cheap. So the prices that we get in this market is then some hours with value of lost load pricing, some hours with prices set by peaker generation, some set by base load, and some price segments with zero price. So I will go one step further, but not more, and to see now, if you can follow me, what happens now if we introduce a storage. So then it becomes a bit more complex, but we try to keep it as simple as possible. It is very challenging to model storage using duration curves because storage is shifting energy in time. So sorted, when we introduce then models with sorted net demand, we need to do some simplifications. And I'm good at simplification, so I managed to do that here as well. And what we did was that we made a very simple storage model, which then explicitly take into account the efficiency of storage and the power capacity of the storage, but then we assume that it has unlimited energy storage capability. So we leave out the problem of finding the optimal storage content in terms of megawatt hours, but we find explicit solution for the power capacity problem. It can be a good representation actually of the concept of using pumped hydro from Norway as a green battery for offshore wind in the North Sea, because in that case it is the power capacity of the exchange that is the limiting factor and not the reservoir contents, which is very abundant. And in this case, we also then assume a very simple operation strategy that we only store surplus wind energy, and we can then discharge it whenever in time we want, and we then want to discharge it where we can earn most money for it. So some of the discharged power will be replacing baseload, some will replace peaker, and we will also discharge some of the stored electricity during hours of load shedding. So we can then derive the optimality conditions for this energy storage using the same principles as the classical theory. And what is interesting here is that we now get a new price segment in the market, which is then between TB and TV in the figure, and this is the time where the storage is the marginal demand. So if the other loads are increased with 1 unit, now the storage is the marginal demand which sets the price, and the price in that segment is set by the value it can receive after storing it and then discharging it. And that is, in this case, if we charge it with 1 more megawatt hour during that period, we can then discharge it to replace some base plant energy at a later stage, at the more left side of the figure. But we have to adjust for the round trip efficiency because we lose some energy. So the price in this segment is then the storage round trip efficiency multiplied by the variable cost of the baseload plant. So we have here shown that with storage, we create new market segments where the storage sets the price. And this interesting thing here is that leads to a new price segment where the wind power earns money. So the price is not zero, but it's actually given by the energy storage value. And that increases the optimal amount of wind power in the system. And the thermal energy is reduced even further. So that is the basic theory. We have derived several variants of this storage operation strategy in this paper that I shown. And this is one of the variants. So I will now show some numerical examples from a very simple model that we made using this analytical framework. And this model is not, so it's not an optimization simulation model. It's just we derive some simple equations for all the equilibrium conditions. So this model is more like a sheet of paper with calculations on, or an Excel sheet. But the input we need is we have chosen to use time series inputs for the European power system with wind and solar time series for wind and solar generation, load, scale everything to 100 megawatt to make it simple, cost from the 2050 EU scenarios, and we use this duration curve model to derive the optimality conditions. So we have this simple system that I showed earlier, just one peaker plant, baseload plant, offshore wind. We used numerical values for offshore wind, a generic energy storage system, and we have used values for lithium ion and pumped hydro as 2 examples. And we then have 3 main cases. The first case is just thermal generation, then we add wind, and then we add wind and storage. So first we just look at how the optimal capacities are in these 3 cases. So when we add renewable, we get less base plant capacity and some more peak plants due to the shift in the equilibrium condition, and energy storage gives even more wind and less thermal. And here we see the sorted prices over the year. We here see that with the introduction of wind power, we get quite much hours with 0 price. And when we add the storage, we get new price segments according to the value of stored energy. So the storage flattens out the price, but as we see in the table here, is that the storage does not influence the average cost of electricity much. This is a quite general result that we have received, that we obtain, is that when we add competitive wind power, the average electricity costs in the market are reduced a lot. And adding even very cheap storage does not influence the prices much. A little bit reduction. It flattens out the prices, but not reduces it much. But what it does reduce is that it reduces the CO2 emissions quite much, because you get even more replacement of thermal energy. And if you look at what happens when in the market when wind power becomes cheaper, I have run this model with gradually more cheaper and cheaper offshore wind, and we see that when it starts to get competitive, we get a sharp rise in the share of supply from variable from wind, but then it kind of saturates, and that is due to the increased curtailment. So when we draw the same plot, but we use the resulting installed capacity on the x-axis, we see the more familiar result of gradually declining energy efficiency of wind energy. We get more curtailment due to all the hours with the surplus energy, and the storage will then counteract this to some extent. So the final numerical result that I will show is what happens when the investment costs of offshore wind are reduced. What happens with the average cost of electricity to the customers, and what happens with the levelized cost of electricity for the different generation. Again, we have plotted the results as a function of wind capital cost with the reversed x-axis. So we see that okay, in the first part, at the most left part, wind is too expensive to become part of the solution. So the average cost of electricity is constant because there are no wind installed. But then when it gets less than 4,500 euros per kilowatt, we start getting wind in the system, and then the average cost goes down. The levelized cost of the baseload plant is gradually increasing since it's used less hours of the year. And the levelized cost of wind is gradually then decreased. And this purple line is the levelized cost of wind if there were no curtailment. But as you saw, there are quite much curtailment. So therefore, the realized levelized cost of electricity supplied is a bit higher than the potential. But what is interesting is to see how the average cost of electricity for the customers are gradually reduced as offshore wind is more competitive. And the dotted line just shows the scenario cost from the EU Commission study. And we then see the difference. What is the difference between the cost without wind, which is then approximately 115 euros per megawatt hour. That is the cost if wind was not present. And if wind is present, the cost of electricity is around 80. So I would then actually say that the system cost of wind in this case is negative, because and the system cost is in this case actually minus 35 euros per megawatt hour, because that is how much more costly electricity would have been in the system without wind. So this is an input to the ongoing discussion about system cost of renewables. I mean that it's negative. Okay, so to conclude from this analytical work, we have shown that all plants recover their cost in a perfect market with variable renewables and storage. And these technologies can coexist with thermal generators in regular energy-only markets, at least in theory. And the merit or the effect of variable renewables changes the capacity mix in a way that all the generators recovers their cost, just as in the classical example. And we have shown that storage triggers more renewables, and we get the new price segments where the storage sets the price according to their energy storage value. And these have several implications for the market solution. And so storage pushes even more thermal capacity out of two reasons. One is that it's used for balancing, and the other is that it also triggers more investment in renewables due to that it also introduce more price segments where the variable renewable can earn money. And the storage also leads to less curtailed variable renewables, even though the capacity of renewables are higher with storage. And the main benefit of storage is to increase renewables further, not to cause lower total prices. Just don't find that result, but it definitively leads to less emissions and more renewables. But there are some limitations of this study that it's important to be aware of. One is that we have treated the demand as inflexible. We have also treated all this variable renewables and demand as deterministic without taking into account uncertainty. And then we have only assumed that all actors are participating in the energy-only market without any out-of-market arrangements, such as long-term contracts for energy. So I will wrap up with just showing one slide from each of these limitations that we are currently working on those problems in current research to kind of expand a bit on the view of what is actually the market effects of renewables. So if we look at the demand side first, just show an example from a recent study that Philip Hertel from Fraunhofer IEE did a couple of years ago with me as a supervisor, where he studied the high-res scenario for Europe in a market model with detailed representation of all possible flexible assets in the different market areas. Here and studied how does the prices change when we add demand flexibility to the market. And at the left, we see an example from one of the simulations from Germany, and at the right-hand side, we see an example from the Finnish market area in the same simulation model. And we see here there is a bi- or multivalent district heating system that sets the price in many hours of the year. That is simply fuel switching for heating. And then we have an alternative cost to the electricity demand from these components, which then can be a very active player in the future market. With a lot of renewables, then we actually have more flexible demand which then will set prices and counteract this effect that many talks about, that you can have a situation where you switch between extreme high prices and zero prices all the time. Now these results show that there can be some alternative to those scenarios in practice. The other thing that we simplified was to not include uncertainty. And ongoing PhD work here at NTNU studies actually the price formation, where we take into account uncertainty in load and generation, and treat the storage device in a similar way as we have worked with representing long-term storage of hydropower in the Nordic system. And then the market models that we use here then uses stochastic dynamic programming, which then balances the trade-off between the operating cost of thermal generation and the cost of not supplying the load in case of energy deficit in the storage. So then the probability of load scarcity due to not having enough energy in the storage is taken explicitly into account in the price setting. And it just shows some examples from simulated prices in a small system, a mini market, so to say, where pricing is explicitly determined by the probability of scarcity situation, and you can read more about that work in the paper that I've linked to. You will get the presentation, of course, and finally. It was this question about long-term contracts and other market arrangements than energy-only markets, because in practice, wind power producers would not maybe dare to earn or guarantee earn all their money in the energy market. It's can be quite lucrative to get a long-term contract with customers with a guarantee price. And that can also be beneficial for the customers, because then they buy guaranteed green electricity. And this is how markets work now. But what is less studied is how this type of long-term contracts influence the prices in the energy-only market and the attractiveness of investments in flexibility. And these long-term contracts are often kind of have some guarantee the delivery of electricity on a yearly average or so. But would it be more suitable to include some requirements for shorter term balancing, so that there is actually that you buy the power that you buy is not only green on an average yearly basis, but on a shorter time scale? And what happens with the spot market if kind of all green producers have long-term contracts? Yeah, so this is ongoing work. If someone is interested in these topics, I'm happy to discuss that. And yeah, that concludes my long introduction. Here are, by the way, some of the references. Okay, so I'm open to questions or comments.
Thank you, Magnus, for a very thought-provoking presentation. Do we have any questions from the audience? Perhaps while the audience is thinking about that, I'll begin with a question. I've been thinking during your presentation about the topic that you've mentioned on your final slide, which is the idea that you're sort of talking about energy-only markets, but Power systems, yes, they want energy, but they also want a range of system services or flexibility. They also want capacity. So how do you ensure that you don't just get, one extreme, you get lots of very cheap nuclear generation or very cheap wind or solar generation that gives you that energy side of things, but then you can't actually operate your system because it's not flexible.
Yeah, I think it's quite a good chance that this can become a big problem as old thermal generators are put out of the market, out of operation, because at present we have abundance of flexibility kind of hidden somewhere in the system, because there are installed capacities around. But at a certain point, these will be obsolete and actually, or maybe too expensive to operate. So then the question is how to ensure investment in these flexible generators or sufficient storage. And I don't think that the price signals in the energy-only markets are strong enough to ensure such investments. That is kind of my at least my hypothesis, is that we need some other arrangements to ensure these investments. Now, I didn't talk about ancillary services markets and such in the presentation. I could have done that. That would be a presentation on its own. But I'm thinking that actually I think that researchers together with the NTNU and the energy authorities are able to create these kind of technical markets that ensures a good stability. We are working on that, and it's also about the technical capabilities of different plants to react on a certain at the right time. But what is the open question is to how to make sure that someone actually will invest in these additional technologies, and I think that is unsolved. I don't think that the energy only market is. I just shown that the energy only market in theory will solve this problem, but I don't believe that it will solve it in practice.
Okay, so you're not advocating for energy only markets.
No, I'm just saying that we proved that it works in theory. So it's about the how you speak about energy only markets as a problem. Now, if you say that prices collapse and energy only markets doesn't work, okay, on what basis can you say that? Now we can say that in theory it works, but if you look at practice, we have to look at what is an attractive investment incentive. Do we need other incentives in practice? This is what I say, and that's why I come into this topic of long-term contract, because this is what works today.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Kaushik, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice presentation, Magnus. I have two questions actually, and maybe you did touch upon, but maybe it would be nice to repeat for my benefit. How did you consider the variability and the uncertainties of the renewables in this? How much there is dilution in this value quantification when you consider the uncertainties?
Yeah. So in this analytical framework that I presented, we assumed no uncertainty of renewable energy, but we assumed full variability. So we took into account that the wind is variable, that its energy output is given by the weather-dependent season of the year, but not the stochastic properties of the wind. So we show that in a kind of in a perfect market with variable renewable, where the uncertainties are certain or they are known, we get firm prices. And then in our recent study, we are studying actually the effect of stochastic wind variations on the price formation, the short-term price formation in detail. But this work that I show here is not linked to the investment problem. This is just a market simulator where we kind of optimize the assets and derive the dual values of the load balance for prices. So of course the question is how to link uncertainty to the investment problem, but that is another. We have not included that in our study. That would be an interesting, challenging expansion, since we are then working with analytic models. Mm-hmm. The question is, at a certain point, we won't include so many. Or the more realistic we get, or more detail we get, the less possible it is to use an analytical framework. So it's a trade-off. If it's too simple, then we are just working with theory that doesn't say anything about the real world. But if we only work with big simulators and optimization models, just pushing numbers, we don't know how the technologies actually interact with each other, so we lose. So actually, I think we need to work with both detailed models and simpler analytic models to gain insights and compare. Yeah.
Maybe if you allow, Damien, then I can ask another following question. Yes. Or not. It's not a follow-up. It's a bit different. We have been seeing load shedding as more of an emergency mechanism in today's power systems, and not as a balancing mechanism. And it was interesting that you put it as a balancing mechanism. At the same time, I know this is connecting to the uncertainty, and I agree that it's fine that you don't have it at this point. But what Energinet in Denmark has been doing is that they are doing hour-ahead balancing and using some of the products available in the neighboring markets or in their markets to do that hour-ahead balancing in order to mitigate the real-time balancing, either through load shedding or through different automatic reserves. Do you see any value of that? And also, especially because pump hydro could be very locational and may not be available everywhere, and storage is very battery storage is still quite expensive, or even only for electric market. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that when it comes to the as I said, it could be a presentation on its own, looking at the operation of markets, and what I believe is the most efficient way is to build the markets around the renewables characteristics and not the other way around. So. And the Energinet Eco's approach has always been that. So I think that they are what they do in this balancing to solve their balancing problem is often in the forefront. And when it comes to the participation of the demand side, actually in Norway we have had for many years the demand side has participated in the medium-term reserve markets. That is, that they actually bid into reserve markets for power on a monthly basis, that they can be activated on the TSO's request, and they then receive a very good payment for that activation, but they also receive a payment for the provision of the being standby to reduce their loads. And at the same time, they also receive a lower grid tariff from the central grid to be standby. So this is typically large-scale industrial sites, metal production, and so on that have been used as a long-term balancing asset for a long time. And I think that the demand side participation in short-term balancing is extremely attractive as well, because you don't need so much energy and not so often, so it doesn't have a big impact on the actual service that the electricity use provide. So when if you have to charge your car, you can certainly reduce that for 15 minutes every now and then without sacrificing too much. So that can be provided to the electricity market, the balance market, at a quite low cost.
Thank you for this comment, and I completely agree on 2 points. One is that we need to have the analytical models together with simulation models, large-scale simulation models to understand. And more importantly, I also, based on our research, we also see that market is today not completely supporting flexible services, at least what we see there. We see the trend that more and more wind is being introduced at least in the Nordic market, and that reduces the price. And we are having negative prices. At the same time, still it is not sufficient for the flexibility services. And I think it's very interesting, this long-term contract revenue of it. Thank you for your presentation, Magnus.
Okay, and thank you very much for questions and for that I could join.
If I can ask just one maybe follow-up question based on that, which was sort of linked to your European example, maybe slide 16, because it seemed to be suggesting that the concept of 100% renewables power system would be very challenging under the current system, given the very high levels of curtailment that you're seeing and the tailoring off in the installed capacity. So I'm sort of wondering your thoughts about how we might get to 100% renewables.
Yeah. So I think so this is a kind of extreme case, because we have inflexible demand and one source. It is although aggregated offshore wind in this example, but it's still one source. So adding also quite several years ago, there were quite many studies on looking at the benefits of mixing wind and solar. It's well known that a combination gives a smoother total output for variable renewables, which then leads to less curtailment than if you are dependent on just one of the sources. So I think that if we add different variable renewables, we add storages. This example is without storage. So if we include storage here, the curtailment goes down, and the kind of practical percentage of variable renewables go up and above 80 in this condition, even with just one variable renewable type and one storage type. So if you have a set of different storage types, different variable renewables, and we introduce, as shown here, the demand flexibility, both from industry side and transport, I am sure that we can reach from at least a point of view and resource point of view very close to 100%. I'm sure. So then it has to work technically, but economically it will be, maybe we need a small thermal generator to take some of the peaks, but that could be fired by some waste or bio waste or something. So you don't need much energy that is not renewable. So I'm very sure that the market solution for very close to 100% renewables is possible with activation of flexibility from demand.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks for your presentation this morning. Thank you. So our final presenter for this morning is Simon Twiggs.